ChatGPT said. He hadn't slept in 40 hours, and it showed in the trembling of his hands, the hollow blaze of his eyes, and the way his shoulders curled as if carrying the weight of the world. The emergency room smelled like disinfectant in despair, and every time the doors opened, the cold night air brushed against his skin like a reminder that he was still alive when his little boy, his whole world, might not be. This is where our story begins, and I promise you, if you stay with me until the end, you'll see how one stranger's words can change the course of a life forever. David sat hunched on the hard plastic chair, the kind designed more for efficiency than comfort. His son, 8-year-old Ethan, had been rushed into the ER after collapsing at home, and the last words he heard from the nurse were a blur: critical condition, tests, please wait. Wait. That was all he could do. And yet every second felt like a punishment, every tick of the clock echoing the fear that he might walk out of this hospital alone. His wife was gone, taken by cancer 3 years ago, and since then, it had been just him and Ethan against the world. But now, the world was winning. He pressed his hands over his face, trying to smother the sound of his own sobs. No one noticed. People walked past him, nurses hurried, doctors spoke in clipped tones, and still he was invisible. He wanted someone to care, someone to see him falling apart, but all he had was the silence of a hospital waiting room and the crushing truth that love wasn't always enough to save the people you couldn't live without. And then, she sat down beside him. At first, David didn't even glance up. The seat creaked softly, the scent of expensive perfume lingered in the sterile air, and he felt the presence of someone composed in the midst of his unraveling. When he finally looked, he saw a woman dressed in elegance, her posture graceful but her eyes carrying the unmistakable shadow of loss. She wasn't a stranger you could dismiss, she was someone who, with just a look, seemed to say she understood more than she should. She didn't introduce herself, not yet. She simply watched him for a moment, her gaze steady but kind, and then she spoke the words that stopped his chest from caving in. You don't have to go through this alone. The simplicity of it broke something inside him. He wanted to argue, to tell her she didn't know him, didn't know his pain, but when his lips parted, all that came out was a sob that seemed to shake the walls around him. And somehow, her presence steadied him, like an anchor thrown into a storm. That night stretched on, hours dragging by as machines beeped behind closed doors. David talked in fragments about Ethan, about the baseball games they loved, about the nights when the boy would crawl into his bed because he missed his mom. The woman listened. She didn't pry, didn't offer clichés. She only gave him space to breathe again. Eventually, she shared her own truth. Her husband, a billionaire whose name David recognized from the headlines, had died suddenly a year ago. She had money, power, all the things people thought mattered, and yet she confessed she had never felt more hollow. People think wealth erases loneliness, she said softly, but grief is the one thing you can't buy your way out of. And in that moment, the space between them wasn't two strangers in a waiting room. It was two souls, battered and bruised, finding a flicker of light in shared darkness. When the doctor finally came out, David nearly collapsed before hearing the words, Ethan was stable. The relief was so sharp it left him dizzy, tears spilling freely as though the dam had finally cracked. He turned to thank the woman who had sat with him, who had carried him through the longest night of his life, but when he looked, she was already rising to leave. Wait, he said hoarsely. Why did you sit with me? She smiled, faint but genuine. Because once, someone sat with me. And it saved me. And just like that, she was gone, leaving David with a hope he didn't know he still had. But this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Days later, after Ethan's release, David thought often about the woman in the ER. He didn't know her name, but he couldn't shake the way her words had pulled him back from the edge. And then, fate intervened. At a small park where he often took Ethan to play, he saw her again. No cameras, no guards, just her, sitting quietly on a bench with a book she wasn't really reading. This time, it was David who sat down. They talked not about hospitals or grief, but about life. About Ethan's dreams of becoming an astronaut, about her struggles with being surrounded by people who wanted her money but not her heart. And slowly, gently, they began to build something neither of them had expected, a friendship carved out of pain but nurtured by honesty. As weeks turned into months, their bond deepened. She helped David see that strength wasn't in pretending not to hurt, but in letting someone walk beside you when the weight got too heavy. He, in turn, reminded her that even with all the loss, life could still hold laughter, like the kind that spilled out of Ethan when she joined in their silly games. It wasn't a love story, not at first. It was something stronger, something real, two broken people finding the courage to live again. And maybe, just maybe, love would follow. By the end, what mattered wasn't her wealth or his struggle. What mattered was this: when the world felt unbearably heavy, when grief seemed to swallow everything good, sometimes all it takes is one person sitting beside you and whispering, "You don't have to do this alone." And if you remember nothing else from this story, remember this: you never know when your presence, your kindness, your willingness to sit with someone in silence might be the very thing that saves them.